What if I told you that one of the most evil things the Nazis ever didn't involve gas chambers or bombs, but a quiet, hidden horror inside a women's camp, a Nazi concentration camp for women, turned into a Br0thel, where survival came at a sickening cost, where women were used, abused, and then discarded by the same system that imprisoned them. It sounds too twisted to be true, but it is, and it's worse than you think. Most people don't know this story. It's been buried for decades. It's not easy to hear, but it's one we need to tell. Because this isn't just about what the Nazis did. It's about how power, fear, and silence can be used to destroy human lives from the inside out. This story matters for women, for victims, for history, for the future. Stay with me. Because once you understand what really happened at Ravensbrück, you'll never forget it. Let's rewind. Germany, 1933. Adolf Hitler is now chancellor. The Nazi Party has taken control. What comes next is the rapid creation of a brutal dictatorship. They begin rounding up anyone who doesn't fit their ideal. Jews, communists, Roma people, homosexuals, the disabled, even outspoken women. The Nazis didn't just want to control the country. They wanted to reshape society from the ground up. And that meant building prisons for anyone who didn't fit in. These prisons were called concentration camps. Why a camp for women? Most people picture men in striped uniforms when they think of camps. But the Nazis made space for women, too. In fact, they built a camp just for women called Ravensbrück. It opened in 1939, a short distance from Berlin. This wasn't some temporary holding site. It was a full-scale operation, a place of forced labor, torture, starvation, and eventually systematic murder. Over time, around 130,000 women would be sent there. Who were these women? They came from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. Some were Jewish. Many were Polish or French resistance fighters. Some were German women who had spoken out or broken rules. Others were arrested simply for who they loved, lesbians, for example, or for being Roma. And sometimes no reason was needed at all. The Nazis saw these women as a social, meaning anyone who didn't fit their perfect image of a loyal, obedient German woman. You could be sent to Ravensbrück for having a child out of wedlock, or for being homeless, or just for being different. Conditions in the camp. At first, there were just a few thousand prisoners, but it quickly grew. Women were packed into wooden barracks with no heat and little sanitation. There were no beds at first, just straw on the floor. Later, metal bunks came, but they were so tightly packed, women had to sleep on their sides like sardines. Food? A thin broth, sometimes a crust of bread. Diseases like typhus and tuberculosis swept through the camp. And the work was brutal. Women were forced to build roads, clear forests or uniforms, or manufacture weapons in nearby factories. One of the most notorious was a Siemens plant, where they worked with dangerous chemicals and live wires. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day, often in freezing temperatures, with beatings for the smallest mistake. Punishment and terror. There were regular roll calls, sometimes lasting hours in the cold, even if someone fainted or died. There were public executions to create fear. And for those who disobeyed, the punishment block. Or worse, transfer to a gas chamber or medical unit. Because Ravensbrück didn't just imprison people, it experimented on them. The rabbits and the Nazi experiments. One of the most horrifying things about Ravensbrück was a group known as the rabbits. These were women, mostly Polish, chosen for Nazi medical experiments. Doctors infected their legs with bacteria, inserted glass or went into open wounds to simulate battlefield injuries, then studied how infection spread. Others had muscles or bones removed. Some were injected with chemical agents to test sterilization. Most of the women were left crippled. Some died from the infections. Many were left in constant pain for the rest of their lives. And many of these same women, after being experimented on, were later forced into the camp Br0thels. Yes, even them. The Nazi Br0thel program. Let's talk about this disgusting system. By 1942, the Nazis were having problems in their men's camps. Prisoners were resisting. Morale was low. People refused to work or follow rules. So the Nazis came up with a plan: reward the obedient. That reward? Forced visits to a Br0thel. The first camp Br0thel opened at Mauthausen. Then others followed: Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen. And where did they get the women? From Ravensbrück. Selection and lies. Women were selected by camp authorities. They were told lies, that they'd be doing special work, that it would be less exhausting, maybe even earn privileges. Some were promised reduced sentences. Some were threatened with death if they refused. A few hoped that maybe this awful duty might help them survive. But what actually happened was far worse than they were told. They were shipped out like property, stripped, examined by doctors, disinfected, then assigned to tiny rooms in the Br0thel buildings. And then the daily nightmare began. What happened inside? Every day, these women were forced to have S3X with male prisoners, sometimes dozens in a single week. No protection, no consent, no dignity. The men who visited were usually privileged prisoners, German criminals, or political prisoners the Nazis trusted. Jewish prisoners were not allowed in the Br0thels. This wasn't about desire. It was about control. It was about showing who was worthy and who was not. It was a system designed to pit prisoners against each other, to destroy solidarity, to humiliate everyone involved. The men sighed. Some of the men refused. They knew the women were suffering. Some said it made them feel even more like prisoners, being forced to perform under watchful SS guards. Others were so broken by starvation and fear that they didn't resist. And some, sadly, took advantage. But many survivors say the Br0thel system was hated by the women inside and by many prisoners outside. The Nazis thought it would boost productivity, but it mostly caused trauma, shame, and division. Psychological damage. The women who lived through this were scarred for life. Many never talked about what happened. After the war, S3 abuse was barely mentioned during trials. Survivors felt ashamed, even though they were victims. Some tried to hide it from their own families. They were seen as dirty by others, blamed for volunteering. Even though it was clearly forced, the psychological trauma lasted decades. Some survivors took their lives. Others stayed silent until old age. Only in recent years have historians started talking openly about the Nazi Br0thels and the women used inside them. Who was responsible? Ravensbrück had many guards, both male and female. One of the most feared was Dorothea Benz, the chief female overseer. She trained other female guards, taught them to use dogs, whips, and fists, chose which women would be beaten, worked to death, or sent to the Br0thels. She was known for her cruelty and coldness. After the war, she was arrested, put on trial, and hanged in 1947. But many guards disappeared or blended back into society. Justice was limited. The end of Ravensbrück. In 1945, the Nazi world was crumbling. The Allies were advancing from all sides. Camps were being emptied or destroyed. At Ravensbrück, the SS forced women on death marches, walking for miles in the freezing cold, often shot along the way. When the Red Army arrived in late April, only a few thousand prisoners were left. Most were sick, starving, or dying. What they found was unimaginable. Piles of bodies, signs of mass graves, documents showing the use of S3 ex-slaves. But the full story took years to uncover. Post-war silence and shame. For a long time, the world didn't want to hear these stories. Many survivors weren't believed, or were told to move on. S3 abuse wasn't discussed at the Nuremberg trials. It wasn't considered a war crime back then. Only decades later did researchers start putting the pieces together, through memoirs, interviews, secret Nazi records, and survivor testimonies. Even today, some details are still missing. Why this story matters today. So why dig all this up? Because this story isn't just about the past. It's about the present. It's about how easy it is to dehumanize someone, how power can turn into cruelty, how silence allows evil to grow, and how women, even in the darkest times, often suffer in ways that history forgets. These women weren't just prisoners. They were human beings, with families, with dreams, with lives that were stolen. They were fighters, survivors, witnesses to one of history's ugliest truths. And we owe it to them to remember. Now that you know the story, really know it, the question becomes, what do we do with it? It's not just about remembering what happened. It's about facing what it means. Because Ravensbrück wasn't an accident. It wasn't some isolated event in a far-off time. It was part of the system, a deliberate, organized effort to strip people of their identity, their rights, their bodies, and their voices. And the women used in the Nazi Br0thels, they were victims of that system in one of the most degrading, inhuman ways imaginable. Let's be clear, this was not S3X. This was not work. This was slavery. It was state-sponsored our *P, disguised as reward, wrapped in lies, and buried in silence for decades. What's even more disturbing is how these women were treated after the war. You would think, after surviving that kind of nightmare, they'd be honored, supported, heard. But for many, the suffering didn't end with liberation. When the camps were freed, the world saw the starvation, the bodies, the barbed wire. But it didn't always see or want to see the hidden abuse, the psychological wounds, the shame, the women. S3 violence wasn't considered a war crime back then. There were no support groups for victims of state-ordered Br0thels. Survivors who spoke out were often met with silence, disbelief, or even blame. Imagine escaping a death camp, only to find out your pain didn't count. So many women kept it secret. They locked it deep inside. Some never told their families. Others carried it until the end of their lives. That silence became another prison. And for decades, history books said almost nothing about the Nazi Br0thels. It was as if the horror had been erased, not just from memory, but from the record. But slowly, that started to change. Historians, researchers, and a few brave survivors began to speak up. They found documents, uncovered records, gave interviews, wrote memoirs. Piece by painful piece, the full picture started to form. And what it revealed was a system far more calculated than most people ever imagined. A system where women were chosen based on their appearance, where medical exams were used to certify prisoners for forced S3X, where men were given passes like it was some kind of reward card, where entire rooms in death camps were dedicated to abuse, and everyone in power knew about it. It wasn't one sick person doing this. It was a machine, a structure, a strategy, and that's the scariest part. Because when people hear about things like this, the Nazi Br0thels, the experiments, the mass killings, they often say, I can't imagine how anyone could do that. But that's exactly the problem. We don't want to imagine it. It's easier to pretend evil only looks like a cartoon villain, that it's always obvious, that it's always someone else. But in truth, evil is often ordinary. It shows up in people doing their jobs, following orders, looking the other way, just going along. The guards at Ravensbrück didn't all come from broken homes or violent pasts. Many were young women, secretaries, nurses, office workers, who were trained to be cruel and told it was normal. And the system? It rewarded them for it, promoted them, gave them power. That's why this story matters, because it shows how quickly the line between normal and nightmare can disappear when hate and control become policy. It shows what happens when women are seen not as people, but as tools, as bodies, as means to an end. And it shows how deep the scars can run, not just on survivors, but on history itself. So where do we go from here? First, we remember, not in a vague, distant way, but with names, stories, and details. We learn the real history, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Second, we listen. We hear the voices that were once silenced, the survivors, the witnesses, the ones who were never asked to speak because their truth was too hard to handle. Third, we question. When systems treat people like objects, when women's pain is dismissed, when power is abused, we don't stay silent. We ask why. We push back. We refuse to let it happen again. And finally, we speak. We tell these stories. We make sure the next generation knows not just the dates and battles of World War II, but the hidden human cost, the Br0thels, the rabbits, the women of Ravensbrück. Because if their stories disappear, then so does the truth. And when truth disappears, history starts to repeat itself. You might think that something like Ravensbrück could never happen again, that we've learned too much, come too far. But every time women are used as weapons of war, every time prisoners are tortured or trafficked, every time victims are silenced because their story is too upsetting, we take a step closer to forgetting. That's why you're still here. That's why you stayed to the end of this video. Because deep down you understand remembering isn't passive. It's a responsibility. And now that you know, really know, what happened to those women, you carry part of that responsibility with you. You carry their memory. You carry their truth. And you can help make sure that what happened in that camp, the pain, the silence, the unspeakable, is never ignored again. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about history differently, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel. Because we're not just telling stories. We're uncovering truths. The kind that don't show up in textbooks. The kind that change how you see the world. We've got more to share and more to remember. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. Thank you for not turning away. Stay curious. Stay awake. And most of all, stay human.